If you want to know if a city is moving in the right direction, visit it and then come back in 3 years and see what's changed. I made my first Minneapolis video 3 years ago, but when I came back this summer, it was not the same city. So today we're going to look at expansions to the Twin Cities transit network, both recent and imminent, the continued build out of what is probably the best big city bike network in the US. We'll look at street redesigns more generally, and we're going to have to grapple with some very traumatic stuff that's happened on the streets of Minneapolis, because all of these things are woven into the identity of the city at this point. And it's going to be a bit of a tightrope act, but I'm going to try to connect all of the dots as best I can. So this will be one of my city visit videos. If you're new here, it's kind of like a travelogue, but a specific kind. It's a chance to see a city through the lens of someone who worked in transportation planning and engineering for a lot of years and doesn't really know how to see a city any other way. Let's get something out of the way. Under normal circumstances, the transit connection between downtown Minneapolis and the international airport 8 miles south is pretty slick, but not in July 2026, because the entire line was shut down for what I think is like track refurbishment and signal upgrades. Short-term pain, and I think it's all going to be back up and running around the time this video gets published. Instead, there were Blue Line replacement buses, which were functional, but trying to replicate a light rail stop pattern with buses leads to some kind of convoluted routing. And then 5th Street downtown, kind of a ghost town without the light rail running. What I'm getting at here is we're not going to spend much time downtown in this video, and not much on the light rail either. Instead, I wanted to get out to some neighborhoods in and around Minneapolis, and for that we're going to do some biking later, but let's start with Metro's bus rapid transit network, which has seen some big expansions in the last 3 years. I think I actually showed you the D-Line BRT in my first Minneapolis video. Well, I'm headed south again, and you'll know the destination in a minute. Like all the BRT lines, the D is designed for efficiency with wider stop spacing and relatively direct routes. So it's a pretty straight shot down Chicago Avenue, except for this little jog out of direction between 34th and 42nd Streets, which I'll come back and explain later in the video. We're actually going all the way to the end of the line because you know I love shopping malls. The transit center at Mall of America is actually very cool and impressive. I normally would have taken the Blue Line here, but the light rail replacement bus is a longer trip from downtown Minneapolis than just taking the D Line. I have to say, given the recent trajectory of shopping malls in the US, I expected to come here and find a lot of empty storefronts and some anemic foot traffic, so I was absolutely not prepared for how bustling it was. The theme park was rocking. I spotted 0 empty storefronts. In fact, I heart Minnesota and Love from Minnesota are literally right across from each other. Extremely specialized retail operations, fine dining galore, live Dungeons and Dragons, West Edmonton Mall, eat your heart out. I might actually come here and make a dedicated video next time because this place is absolutely fascinating. Let's go to one of the newer BRT lines, the B, which runs east-west through central Minneapolis along Lake Street and opened in June of 2025. It goes all the way into downtown St. Paul, but we're going to keep things on the west side of the Mississippi River today. I picked the bus up in Uptown, which seems like it's continued to densify since I last visited. You know, I'm pretty sure when I made my Minneapolis video 3 years ago, I roasted Lake Street for being a traffic sewer with no bike facilities. Well, now it not only has a BRT line, it has a two-way protected bike lane running along the north side. And there are a ton of bike improvements in this area that we're going to get to later in the video. Lake Street is such an interesting corridor, lots of density and ground floor retail in the west toward the chain of lakes, and it gets a lot more diverse as you move east, and you remember what a magnet for immigrants this region is. In a way, the B-Line is really a microcosm of what transit should be. Frequent, direct, democratic, serving people from all walks of life, connecting to all kinds of diverse housing, commercial, and employment. So let's head back downtown because we're going to take the newest BRT line, the E, and we're going to pick it up on Hennepin Avenue. The E-Line debuted in December of this past year, and there's been a ton of reconstruction on Hennepin along the alignment, most of which we'll get back to later in the video, but this stretch through the heart of downtown where the two-way raised bike path runs behind the station, pretty sweet. The E has a bit of a different vibe to it than the other BRT lines. Hennepin itself, as you get into the wedge and uptown, kind of a nice mix of commercial storefront and dense development, and a big transfer point at Uptown Transit Station where it intersects with the B line and a bunch of other bus routes. What's very cool about the E-Line is it connects several dense neighborhood nodes, but it also weaves right through the chain of lakes on its way southwest. So you get a stop at Bajay-Makaska, which is an amazing urban amenity. Perfect spot for all kinds of recreation, including fishing apparently. Continuing southwest, you get solid activity nodes on Sheridan, and then around 44th and France. We're not going to go all the way to the end of the E-Line, but it was recommended I check out the area around the 50th and France station, so let's indulge that. I want to talk about the station area more broadly because there are some very interesting things going on here. But first, let's talk about the Metro BRT stations themselves. I'd actually hesitate to call this BRT because there are a lot of locations that don't have dedicated transit lanes, but the stations themselves hit all the marks and 50th and France is representative. Conspicuous branded signage with real-time arrival information. Fare dispensers and validators with immigrant-friendly translation features because part of the point here is payment happens off-board so the driver doesn't have to check fares, which shortens dwell times. And yes, you will sometimes see fare enforcement on board. Platforms slightly elevated to speed up boarding. Bike racks if you're going to lock up and ride. Trash and recycling. Emergency call box because you never know. In fact, they post a huge code of conduct to remind you to wear clothes and do things you'd hope would be common sense. Also, this is Minnesota, so this is an important feature 6 months a year. As far as the 50th and France station area itself, is it good urbanism? I think everyone has their own definition of what that means. Does it have density? Sure. Is it walkable? Yeah, I think so. Does it have lots of shopping and dining destinations in a streetcar suburb type of urban form? Yeah, it's got that, and it's got a bit of a suburban lifestyle center feel to it too. So what is the verdict? Is 50th and France urban, or is it suburban? And I think the answer is yes. France Avenue is the jurisdictional boundary between Minneapolis on the east and the suburb of Edina on the west. So the street frontage and sidewalks on the Edina side have their own kind of suburban town center character. And the sidewalks on the Minneapolis side, well, if I tell you that the city of Edina has double the fiscal capacity ratio of the city of Minneapolis, and you watched my video on that subject, none of this will be a surprise. Even the bike advocacy seems more aggressive in Edina. But I think it's the E-Line project itself that's probably responsible for a lot of the intersection improvements here, including brand new pedestrian call buttons. I was a little harsh on the city's beg button situation in an earlier video, and my understanding now is this is an ADA thing. The state apparently interprets the Americans with Disabilities Act as requiring the buttons as accessibility features when a signal is reconstructed because it helps visually impaired folks better identify the location of the crosswalk and what the status of the signal is. It's a pretty charitable interpretation of ADA, but then being charitable is kind of woven into the whole personality of this place. I'll expand on that more in a bit. First, brief reminder to do all the things. Consider subscribing to the newsletter at nerd4cities.com. New content at least a couple times a month, including installment 2 of Ask a CityNerd. Submit a good question and I'll try to give you a useful answer, or at least an entertaining one. Once I get enough subscribers, maybe I'll start counting up the venues I can fill, but kind of stuck at movie theater level right now, so you know what to do. Seattle event with the urbanists Ryan Packer at Town Hall, September 15th. Tickets should now be available to the general public. Check down the description for a link. I've got a whole work in progress that I'm going to run through at the show. It's going to be a bit of a production. And ticket pre-sale for September 28 in Philadelphia with Dr. J. Arzu is now open on my Patreon and for paid newsletter subscribers. Just a lot going on in September, and I'm trying to figure out Las Vegas and Cleveland for October, so stay tuned on those. Okay, let's talk bikes. Minneapolis does tie with Portland for the highest bike score rating of any major US city, but I gotta be honest, I know both of these cities pretty well, and if the rating is just based on network and infrastructure alone, I think Minneapolis is clearly a cut above, and the gap is widening rapidly. I've discussed the Midtown Greenway in previous videos, and it's still one of the great urban bike-oriented development corridors in the nation, but I wanted to explore a lot further today. Oh, and shout out to Venture Bikes for the great rental right on the Greenway. Support your local bike shops, people. So you could say Minneapolis is gifted with lakes and natural features that are perfect for an off-street path system, but I also think that undersells the politics and the culture that make not just recreational trails possible, but a lot of the street redesigns we're gonna look at as well. Before we get to those though, let's enjoy some lake vibes as we go from around Lake Nokomis in the south, along Minnehaha Creek, and through Lake Harriet and Bede-Makaska on our way uptown. So, off-street paths are something that the Twin Cities region does exceptionally well, but what I really wanted to talk about today was street redesigns because there is so much going on. I focused on South Minneapolis just because of the sheer amount of projects that are recently completed or underway. But there's another aspect of South Minneapolis streets that it would be absolute malpractice for me to not talk about. And that's the existence of what are really open wounds in the city's fabric. Locations where people were essentially executed on the street by law enforcement. This is 38th Street and Chicago Avenue, or George Perry Floyd Square, right in the heart of South Minneapolis. George Floyd was killed here in May of 2020. I visited the memorial when I made my first Minneapolis video in 2023, and I mentioned it briefly then, but it didn't feel right to share images at the time. I guess now it feels less right to try to sweep this kind of thing under the rug, partly because the history and the politics around this particular horrific event are, I think, really inextricable from the things I talk about on this channel. I mentioned earlier, the D-Line BRT now diverts around this intersection rather than maintaining its original alignment straight down Chicago. Also, I wondered when I visited this time, would the George Floyd memorials be fading away physically as the year 2020 recedes further into memory? And instead, what I found was the opposite. The memorial is larger, there are more people visiting, and the location around 38th and Chicago is getting formalized and improved in pretty radical ways to accommodate all that. The council-adopted intersection concept is built around the idea that it should be a community space where people can gather and remember, with tons of bike and pedestrian improvements, traffic calming, and restoration of D-Line service on Chicago Avenue. Unfortunately, there are locations in South Minneapolis where the scene of the crime is just months old, and the city hasn't had anywhere near the time to process what's happened and figure out how to reconcile collective grief and anger and love with what's also a culturally important public right of way. This is Nicollet Avenue, just south of 26th Street, where Alex Preddy was shot at least like 10 times. I don't think we actually know the number because the current administration hasn't made evidence available, allowed any competent investigation, or held anyone accountable at all. I think it's fair to say Alex Preddy was executed for the crime of trying to be a good neighbor in the most heroic possible sense. All of this happened on the stretch of Nicollet that, for years, the city has been marketing as Eat Street, a stretch of shops and restaurants that contains a lot of the diversity that makes the city great and apparently makes it a target for people who feel threatened by immigrants. The city has even bigger plans for Nicollet. When I was here 3 years ago, a shuttered Kmart building stood at the location where Nicollet Avenue was vacated, just north of Lake Street. Just an extremely bad urban planning idea that the city is now in the middle of rectifying, which you can see at the south end of Eat Street. My recommendation is come to Nicollet, spend some time grappling with the reality of what happened just south of 26th Street and what's happening in the country, frankly, and try to support the local businesses while you're here too. It honestly was my intention to do a straight bike infrastructure tour of South Minneapolis and not go out of my way looking for these locations where the city's just been gashed open, but I just don't think it's avoidable. This is Portland Avenue and 34th Street, where Renee Good was killed by ICE agents, also in January of this year. 2026 has just not been good. Some of the things that have been happening just really call into question what is the point of all this, of talking about transit and walkability and biking and density and mixed use and all the things that make cities great. What is the point when people who don't believe in cities and don't like them can just come in and, with impunity and apparently no accountability, simply kill the people who are standing up for their neighbors? There are some very basic things that are broken in our country that are a lot bigger and more foundational than the things I ever talk about on this channel. And visiting certain places in Minneapolis has a way of forcing you to confront this kind of thing in a way that no other city does. I'm going to be honest, I don't have any way of making a transition between talking about this stuff and talking about bike infrastructure, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence by trying to be smooth about it. You might have noticed that there was a justice ride going on while I was at the Renee Good Memorial. I didn't participate because I'm just not a joiner of organized activities, but I did roll down Portland Avenue in their wake. They took the whole street. I stuck to Portland Avenue's buffered bike lane, which is good as far as these things go. Some of the intersection treatments are unexpectedly nice, and the lane itself is buffered from traffic and the parking door zone. But there is a ton of variety in the South Minneapolis bike network, so let's do a tour and experience the whole spectrum. And this isn't so much about bike infrastructure in a vacuum. A bike network exists for people to get between places where they live and work and eat and shop and play. This is 42nd Street, which in the western segment is more of a bike boulevard on a residential street, and to the east is more of an old school bike lane, but with pretty thoughtful treatments at busy intersections. One thing you can't help noticing along 42nd, it's not a major commercial street, but it has these great commercial nodes at certain locations. Like, I just kept wanting to stop and hang out at certain spots. Some of the bike infrastructure in Minneapolis is just okay. Plastic delineators, I kind of want to say is better than nothing, but the more I see this in different cities, the less I'm convinced that's true. Hardened, protected two-way bike lanes, definitely better, but not especially groundbreaking. You see this kind of treatment in lots of US cities, but what I really wanted to understand was what Minneapolis is doing that puts them at the top of rankings like Bike Score. And for that, I had to go to Bryant Avenue. Now, north of Lake Street, Bryant is a bike boulevard on a low-traffic street. Again, fine, but nothing you won't see in a lot of US cities at this point. But once you approach Lake Street and cross south, the bikeway takes on a pretty radically different character. Instead of having to navigate a shared environment and worry about getting doored or cars pulling out of on street parking spots without checking behind them first, which I see on bike boulevards way more often than I'd like to, the city tried something different. Eliminating on street parking from the east side of the street, expanding the sidewalk, and adding a two-way bike facility, vertically and horizontally separated from traffic. It's hard to overstate the transformational power of what the city did here. This is what Bryant Avenue looked like just a couple years ago, and this is the same location, July 2026. And it's more than just bike infrastructure. It's just a more pleasant place to be. It connects more of those commercial nodes that you find all over South Minneapolis. There's more permeable surface, and it looks like improved stormwater runoff treatment. And I don't think I'm alone in seeing it as a massive unqualified success, because it seems like Bryant Avenue has become a proof of concept for the city to implement some of the same extremely good ideas in some even more challenging places. Which brings us back to Hennepin Avenue, which I rode all the way north from Lake Street through the Uptown Transit Station, about a mile up to where it interfaces with Interstate 94. The two-way bike path is complete, even though the full street reconstruction isn't done yet, and it really does feel state of the practice, or I hate to overstate it, but it maybe even feels like Minneapolis setting a new standard for multimodal street reconfiguration in the US. The design is not one size fits all. It's very context dependent. You've got sections that are buffered from the street with planting strips and demarcated from the pedestrian zone by tactile pavers, sections that are demarcated by a planted buffer, sections that run behind transit stations. And it's not just an improvement for transit and bikes. I believe the city has added enhanced pedestrian crossings, consolidated driveways to eliminate conflict points, tightened up intersections to reduce crossing distances. It's been a complete rebuild. It's just really thoughtfully designed, and at the same time, I'm kind of blown away that the city was even able to get this done politically. There's a great piece on streets.mn that I'll link down the description, which explains some of the design decisions in detail and how the allocation of right-of-way is consistent with the city's various adopted plans, which prioritize climate action and puts people walking, biking, and taking transit first. But cities doing right by their adopted climate plans and transportation hierarchy are practically the exception to the rule. Anyway, when in Minneapolis, I strongly encourage you to visit the reconfigured Hennepin and support the local businesses because they've gone through a lot to get to this point. And there are more street reconfigurations underway. Franklin Avenue, I'm gonna hit you up next time. Make no mistake, it's a battle to get projects like these done. The next ground zero, apparently, Lyndale Avenue, due for reconstruction in 2028. There is a whole lot of space for motor vehicle traffic on Lyndale and precious little space for anything else. I just submit that if the design of your urban street is so hostile that you need rapid flashing beacons to make it safe to cross, you've already kind of lost the plot. I suspect Minneapolis is gonna get this design right, but there's already opposition from the usual places. So instead of hoping, consider supporting the work Move Minnesota is doing to make sure you end up with a more livable, people-centered street. Okay, I just know that you all know better than to think that I was gonna get out of here without talking about trains. The Blue Line might have been temporarily out of commission on this visit, but the Green Line extension, which will run deep into the metro area's southwest, really starting to take shape, including rebuilt and improved trail connections. Man, I just love that new transit infrastructure smell. It was a good visit. At the airport, I was reminded that there is a whole mythos around Minnesotans being overly courteous and agreeable. I think that's oversimplifying it, but I do think there's something in the local culture There's a generosity of spirit that maybe leads to better outcomes in street redesigns. And I think it's the same generosity and progressive mindedness that's made the Twin Cities such a hotspot for refugee resettlement, which I think made it an obvious target for DHS goons, but I suspect they also picked on Minnesota because they thought the locals would be too polite to resist. Just a total misreading. Minneapolis, nice to immigrants, not so nice to masked kidnappers. My kind of city, and I hope to get back here again soon. Okay, so it was a little disappointing not to get to ride the light rail while I was in Minneapolis. You could even say I was suffering from train withdrawals. Maybe you've experienced this phenomenon yourself, and if so, I've got the perfect prescription. Downey Express Season 3, Bangkok to Bali. If you've never seen Mike Downey's content before, he rides passenger trains all over the world, sometimes luxury class, which is fun to experience vicariously, but what I think he does best is immerse you in how locals experience intercity travel wherever he goes. In episode 2 of Bangkok to Bali, we take the train over the border from Thailand into Malaysia. And then I don't want to spoil it, but the itinerary doesn't go as planned. Luckily, Mike and his buddy Seb are very resourceful, so they find a creative and pretty convoluted route to get to their next pit stop, Singapore, and it's just a ton of fun to ride along with them. Downey Express Season 3, Bangkok to Bali is a Nebula original. The full season is available on the platform right now, and it's a perfect example of how Nebula works with its creators to expand the scope and the quality of what they do. You'll see this in the ever-expanding catalog of urban planning, engineering, and architecture content on the platform, but it shows up in all the incredible content niches where Nebula has so much depth, like culture, politics, comedy, and a lot more. Now, a Nebula subscription is a great way to support my channel and to get my content early, ad-free, and sponsor-free. But really, subscribe because of the amazing roster of creators. Have I mentioned Tom Scott is on Nebula now? Every Monday, you'll get the latest episode of his new series where he visits every county in England and just does what I can only describe as Tom Scott things. If you know, you know. And Tom's stuff is emblematic of what you'll find on the platform. Content that's a little more thoughtful, that's created by humans for humans, which is more important than ever. And there is a pretty big idea behind all of it. Raising the level of all the creators on the platform and growing it into a prestige streaming service. So if you subscribe to Nebula using my custom link down the description or the QR code right here on screen, you are going to get the best possible deal. All the content from all these amazing creators, ad-free, sponsor-free, early, and sometimes exclusive, for 50% off the regular price when you sign up for an annual subscription. Lifetime subscription, possibly an even better deal. The regular price is currently $500, but with my creator link, it's just $300. You pay once, and you get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. You'll also get guest passes, one each month or 3 per quarter if you're on annual or lifetime, so you can share your favorite stuff with friends and family. Once active, guests can binge all the Nebula content they want for a week, and no payment info is required. Again, use my link or the QR code right here to get the best possible deal. It's nebula.tv/CityNerd, and then go watch Downey Express, Bangkok to Bali, episode 2 right now. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support, which allowed me to tack a couple extra days onto the trip so I could see what's new in Minneapolis. The support from Nebula subs is super helpful too. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode in a week or two, and I'll see you then.